Do you like what you hear? Then you need a Devon bass. Devon bass. Better by design. Whether you're old school or whether you're new school, we discuss it all for the only one that matters. Our guest today is going to be Kelly Kirk Westberry. She is a marvelous lady, a teacher, someone I've taught alongside for the last at least 10 years. I've taught 2 of her children in the classroom and in private music lessons. She's a wonderful lady, and she has an incredible story to tell and a heartwarming story to tell about hearing God's voice and learning when to sit down. Let's join our interview in progress. Folks, welcome to another episode of For the Only One That Matters, where I talk to Christian artists and worship pastors and leaders from around the country, and I ask them all sorts of questions. It's a mild form of gotcha journalism, because she doesn't know what I'm going to ask.
A little scary.
But I've heard that she's a formidable opponent, and so we'll see. Kelly, why don't you go ahead and tell the world about you. Who are you? What do you do?
Well, let's see. Where do I start? I am, first and foremost, the wife of Lee Westberry. I'm the mom of 4 children, wonderful children. My oldest is 20, and she's a sophomore at Covenant College up in Lookout Mountain, Georgia. Then I have Alyssa, who's 18 and a killer bass player with a great teacher.
Gosh, who would that be?
I don't know.
She's one of my faves.
Yeah, mine too. And then I have Leah, who is 14, and she is a freshman in high school. So 3 daughters. And then I have our bonus blessing, my son, who is 7. And so
also one of my faves. That kid is he's one of the happiest kids I've ever seen.
Yes, he's wonderful. Up and coming pianist. And
I hear he has a good teacher too.
He does have an amazing teacher.
Wow.
We are so blessed with great teachers. So he's a lot of fun. I'm learning how to be a boy mom. I've never experienced. I only had a sister, and I've had girls for all these years. So it's been a learning curve for me.
Stand by. It gets better.
Yeah. So I homeschool. So there's that. So that's has been a large part of my life for many years, is schooling my children. But in addition to that, I am on staff at Marietta Vineyard Church. And we've been at the church for about 17 years. I've been on staff for the past 7 years, officially. Unofficially for a lot more than that. I've been I was the volunteer kids and youth director for about 7 years before actually coming on staff as the children and youth director. And also one of the worship leaders, helped to head up the worship ministry. Along with our pastor, we sort of co-lead the worship ministry. And recently my title was changed. I'm not that big on titles, but we sort of changed it to Minister of Discipleship. So encompassing more
Mrs. Fancy Pants.
more families, not just children and youth.
Yeah.
We've expanded to really discipleship of families.
Excellent. Excellent. So a couple things I really want to touch on is, first of all, your personal history. When did you become a Christian?
That's a hard question for me. I was born really almost born in the church. I'm one of those that was in church probably from the first week of my life on.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember the actual date that I first asked Jesus to come into my life and take away my sins and come into my heart. I heard that my whole life. And so I prayed that prayer many times as a child. I can remember, in fact, being a little stressed about that
Oh,
because, I knew from, almost from birth that Jesus was the only way to heaven. And so I, of course, wanted to go to heaven. And so I would just, every few days I would pray as a child, God, just if you're not in my heart, please come into my heart so that I can be sure to
oh,
go to heaven. I was very afraid. And sometimes I would lay awake at night and just, be afraid that somehow I had not prayed good enough, maybe I
oh
missed
man.
it, let me pray
Yeah.
again just to be sure. It wasn't till my freshman year of college that I really felt peace about my salvation. I know I was saved as a child, but as a early college student, I my first semester of college, I actually had an atheist professor who it was his mission to turn every student who had faith away from their faith. And so from day one, and it was an English class of all things, but he berated Christians in every class. He would,
Hmm.
tell us how narrow-minded we were and how, that there's no intelligent person could ever believe in God. And so that semester, I was 17, I was a young freshman, and I wrestled with my faith. I'm so thankful for this professor because I wrestled. I had to really search, is this my faith? Is it my parents' faith? And I remember I went to a youth retreat around maybe 4 months into that first year of college when I was kind of in the middle of this wrestling time. And this woman got up and she began to speak. And her first intro, I remember the introduction to her talk. She said, she got up, she said, I'm one of the uncomfortable few who can't tell you the exact date that I got saved. As soon as she said that, my ears perked up and I went, there's someone else like me, I'm not the only one. And she began to explain that all of our righteous acts are like filthy rags, that doesn't matter what good we've done, none of it is righteous before the Lord. As I began to listen to her, the light bulb kind of went on and I realized, it's not my work. It's not my prayer. It's not how good I've prayed, or how many times I've prayed. It's his work. And
Yes.
I was 17. I really nailed it down at that time. I said, I don't know when I was saved, but right now, right today, I'm going to rest in your work, what you did on the cross for me, um, because it's by grace alone that we're saved through faith.
Wow.
And so that was when I really came into, I believe, an understanding of what that meant.
It's funny when you mention the atheist professor. Um, I've only known two honest atheists in my life, and by honest, I mean
True.
they're not angry. They weren't angry. A lot of people call themselves atheists. They're just slapping at God or slapping at the church
They're
or
mad
the
at God.
church. They're
Yeah.
mad at God or God's people or the church, whatever. But I only knew two honest atheists, and they were atheists by conviction. They'd honestly studied. This one guy has
Mm,
a doctoral degree in psychology, so I mean, he's in the Mensa world, and he was an atheist by conviction because of his studies and his everything.
mm-hmm.
And I met him at the now I went out when I was 58. I went and got my master's degree in music composition, and it was a bucket list thing. I have no designs of becoming a composer by trade. It's just I just wanted it, so I went there, and all of a sudden I found myself surrounded by I mean, a more the most widely varied type of people that you would
Mm,
ever meet.
yes.
And my atheist friend, he said he caught a hold of me later, and we kept in touch. We've kept in touch since college. He says, um, he said, I can't be a Christian anymore. I mean, I can't be an atheist anymore. And I said, Michael, that's cool from my perspective, but I got to know why. He says, well, you played a part in this. And I said, oh, tell me how that worked. He said, I came down to breakfast one morning and you were having breakfast and your I say every semester you got assigned a professor, and he worked with you for 6 months virtually, and then you come back for a residency for 1 week,
Okay.
one in spring, one in fall. And he says, I saw you sitting next to your professor and his partner. They're gay, and he said, and you were laughing with them, and you were eating breakfast. You were having this wonderful conversation with them, and I say, he said, that's stupid. I thought Christians hated gay people.
You blew a stereotype.
I know, right? And I said, well, I got to tell you 2 things about that. I'm sorry that Christians taught you that, because that's the only place he could have gotten that information. And I said, but on the other side, I said, they're my friends. And Jesus says to love your neighbor as yourself, and the neighbor is whoever's in your periphery. And I love Roger. I love his partner. And we've talked about all this kind of stuff. But I said, I'm friends with him. And he thought, yeah, I said, that's just so weird. That's just so stupid. And he said, it has been bugging me. And the essence, that was part of his journey to Christ. And now he's still an oddball. He's got some ideas that I'm not sure I subscribe to, but he's not an atheist anymore. And
that's amazing.
So I'm glad that your atheist professor drove you to Christ.
I'm grateful. Yes.
You should send him a card every Christmas.
It's true.
And Easter.
Good idea.
The 2 high holy days of Christianity. Send him a card. Well, now, all right. So unlike you, when I got saved, I can tell you exactly when it was. Today is my anniversary, as a matter of fact. 48 years ago.
Happy birthday.
Thank you so much. I was in boot camp, and I went to church in boot camp because that was the last place my company commander would be. And I wasn't a Christian, but I knew he was the devil. He's the only man in my life I've ever been afraid of, physically, in every way. I mean, so in church was 3 hours away from this man. And every week they'd bring in a different church, local church from the area to do a Protestant service. Well, the week before this, they'd had a Southern Baptist preacher come in. And he was a hellfire and brimstone preacher, and he was good. He was good. I'm not making fun of him when I call him that, but he was hellfire and brimstone. And when he preached about heaven, you could hear the angels sing. And when he preached about hell, you could feel the fire licking up around your ankles. Wow. This guy was like, so I knew that there was something here. And I went home. I went back to my barracks. Next week, I came back to church again, and I'm saying, there's something there. I got to figure that out. Well, this week they brought in a Pentecostal, full gospel black church.
Nice.
I've never seen anything like that in my life. And as a musician, and you know this, I think Brooklyn Tab on steroids, right? Just, oh my gosh, I get goosebumps thinking about it. And I remember when the music started, they had a Hammond B3 organ, and the preacher was an air sucking preacher, like, and the Lord. Yep. And whenever you suck in, the Hammond B3 organ go, wow!
Yep.
And the bass player, and the drummer was whacking. And they had these beautiful black women in their purple robes and their white tassels and the tambourines with the torty things hanging off, right?
Yep.
They were Shiloh two-stepping. I mean, there wasn't nobody in that stage that was standing still. I elbowed my way to the front like I was in a mosh pit, and I was just like, what is going on? And I closed my eyes, and this gorgeous music was washing over me. Now, the song they were doing is the stupidest Christian song on the face of the planet. It's a campfire song. It only takes a spark to get a fire going. Yeah. All right. So I don't like that
That's my childhood right there.
I know. I hate that song. I think it's the most insipid song on the planet.
It's a horrible song.
But you have never heard it done by a black full gospel choir.
Cannot even imagine what that sounds like. I'm
telling you, it was stunning. And so I'm closing my eyes, and this music just washing over me. And I wish you could see the goosebumps in my arm because I'm reliving it. And all of a sudden I'm crying, and I didn't know why I was crying. I was thinking, why are you crying? You never felt this good in your life, and it's true. Then all of a sudden I knew that Jesus was standing, at about 2:00. If I put my arm out, I knew I'd touch him on the shoulder. And then, this is not your typical conversion story, I was overwhelmed with terror. Absolute, complete terror. And these words went dancing through my head from right to left. Not left to right, right to left. I have no idea why that is. But from right to left, I saw these words: depart from me, you wicked, to the fire prepared for the devil and his angels. I never knew you. And if the gates to hell had opened up behind me, I would have walked through them because these words went through. You've been weighed in the scales and found wanting. Ah.
Wow.
If the gates to hell had opened up behind me, I
Oh
would have
my.
walked through. I was guilty as charged. I had no argument. I had no defense. And these words, I knew I was a sinful man in the presence of a sinless God. Those words too. And I remember I never heard words like that before. And I knew that hell was my destination. Hell is what I deserved. I had no defense. Boom. I'd had a just trial and I was guilty. But then these words go through my head. But I've loved you with an everlasting love.
Mm.
I didn't know what any of these were Bible words.
I was going to say, you probably didn't even know that they were scriptures.
No, I just knew that Jesus right here, he was right here.
Wow.
And then I had like a fever from the top of my head, the bottom of my feet.
Yeah.
And my Pentecostal friends get all googly eyed over that. And, but then I'm crying like I've never cried. We're talking ugly crying.
Mm-hmm.
And there was no altar call given. There was no invitation for salvation. But I'm telling you, when I walked out of there, I knew I was saved.
That was it.
And my life has been totally, completely changed since then. Now, at the same time that happened, my wife, we were dating. We'd secretly asked each other to marry. I asked her to marry me when she got engaged before the end of her junior year in high school. All right. I was 2 years ahead of her.
Yeah.
I remember when my daughter was a junior in high school, I just looked at her one night after dinner and said, don't do it. She said, what? But she had been having some really hard problems at home, and she suffered from depression. They were vacationing in Hawaii, and she made up her mind that she was just gonna give it up. She was gonna swim as far as she could and let it go. And she's got up that morning, and sometime around that morning, she felt this huge cloud lift off of her. And all of a sudden, the sky was blue, the birds were singing, the sun was out, and she felt light and carefree and released. Well, when I wrote to her and told her that I was saved, we put two and two together. And that moment in that church service was that moment in Hawaii. So
that's amazing.
Do you think we were meant for each other? I don't know.
No question. Yeah.
But then God said one more thing to me in that service. He says, I have a ministry for you. So I'm thinking I'm going to be a preacher or a worship pastor. I may do something like what you're doing. And so I spent the next 20 years knocking on those doors, and those doors never opened. God never gave me permission to go through those doors. And I am just was flabbergasted because I even had a lady come up to me after church service at a Foursquare church in Washington State saying, I've been praying for you. Now, every church has this lady.
Yes.
Every church has this lady, and they're legit. They are total legit. Yep. And when she prayed for you, stuff was going to happen.
You knew things were going to happen.
Yes. Yep. She was a widow. And she spent all her time in the Word and praying and everything. And so when Melody came out and said, Paige, I've been praying for you. I'm going, well, thank you, Melody. Thank you. She says, yeah, I believe God has a word for you. It's, be still and know that I'm God. I think he wants you to sit down. And I'd been leading worship at this church. And the pastor was discipling me to turn me into one of those, right? And I remember telling her thank you. And then she walked away. I said the rudest thing in my head that I've ever said to anybody in my life. You ought to lay off the caffeine and pizza before you go to bed, Melody. And you
didn't like that word.
Yeah. So I'm walking through town the very next day on a Monday. And a lady from another church, she was the Melody in the other church. She comes up to me and she's walking up to me and she's looking at me. And I have this sinking feeling in my gut because I know what's going to happen. She says, Paige, I've been praying for you. God says, be still. What's that mean?
All right. So some confirmation there.
Okay. But did I obey? Oh, no. We ended up going to another church where they didn't know about this. Oh, and I'd gone to this pastor of this church and told him, he says, Paige, out of the mouth of two or more witnesses, ain't one thing be confirmed. Yeah. He said, you got to step down.
You got to do what God's telling you to do.
Yeah. So I stepped down, but inside I'm hacked. I'm really ticked because God, you promised me ministry and now I'm sitting down. What? So we ended up going to another church, which conveniently didn't know about this conversation that God and I have been having. and I lead worship there. Well, after a while, we come back to this church, and another guy was leading worship, and I knew him. His name was David. And I walked up to him after church and said, David, I noticed you don't have a bass player. I'm available if you need me. And he looked at me, and tears rolled down his face. He says, Paige, you walked in. I said, Jesus, here's my bass player. Paige, God says no. He says, you're to be still. Oh,
He was serious.
my gosh. And I was dumb as a brick. So I go
I have
home.
a similar story. That's so funny because my story is very similar.
I'm driving home from that church service, and I'm angry like nobody's ever seen me this angry. Glenda was homesick with the kids. I'd been at church by myself, and I slammed my fist on the dashboard of my car and says, God, you promised me ministry. What the H-E double hockey sticks about my ministry? I cussed at God. What? But it's one of those moments. It's like he's sitting in the seat next to me, and this still, quiet voice says, your ministry. When was anything mine ever yours? And it was like you just punched me in the gut. I lost my breath, and I realized that I'd taken something that was God's and called it mine. That never ends well in the Old Testament. And so I go home, and I spent all afternoon Sunday praying, just repenting. And I get up, having done business with God, say, all right, God, I'll do it your way from now on. I'll never call it my ministry again. And I didn't lift up a guitar in church for 20 years because the Navy moved me. And the further south we went, the Pentecostal churches we were going to got nuttier and nuttier and nuttier. And I didn't feel safe in them with my kids and my wife. We ended up going to Reformed Presbyterian churches where they did not need a Pentecostal worship leader. They didn't need anybody, especially guitar. Reformed Presbyterian Church? Really? Not going to happen. And so I was forced for the next 15 to 20 years to sit in these Reformed churches full of the godliest men and women I've ever met. And I had nothing else to do but to be still and to learn that he is God. And later on, I got all this settled. Okay, I'm not upset that I'm not going to be a preacher or a worship pastor, but I'm still kind of curious about this ministry thing. And he said, and God, I had one of those moments where God spoke into my heart. He said, you're asking if you can have a job in the church. That's what you're really asking. And that answer is no. But you have a ministry. You're a husband, you're a father, you're a friend. Fulfill your ministry. And it was inferred, this will be the last time we have this discussion. And at that moment, there was just such incredible peace. And I started, that was about that time I started teaching privately here in the metro Atlanta area. And Glenda and I were talking about this. She says, honey, your three spiritual gifts are teaching, administration, and prophecy. You're teaching Christian children, the next generation worshiper believers. Your administration, that's your scheduling, taking money, all that kind of stuff. You're doing all the administration stuff, and you're speaking God's word into the lives of your students. That's prophecy. She says, you've been in the ministry for the last 20, you've been in the ministry for 20 years. Typical man. No, I have my idea of ministry.
Well, we always have that box of what we think it's supposed to look like. And, it's funny because I have a very similar story. My whole life, starting from about age 9, I can remember telling the Lord that I was his for ministry. I was willing to do whatever he called me to do. I felt called to music ministry very strongly and missions. Those were the two real, strong pulls. And so went to music school, got my degree, got my undergrad degree in music ed, just because they told me not to get a performance degree. I wasn't really planning to be a music teacher. I wanted to be in ministry. So I thought I'll get a music ed degree because it's not a performance degree. And halfway through, really discovered that I was good at teaching and enjoyed teaching. And so started to do that and realized I could make a little bit of money doing that. So enjoyed that. But I went on, got my master's in music, and all the time, just my thought process and my plan was I'm going to be in music ministry. That's the plan.
You had it figured out, didn't you?
Yeah. I mean, I had it. That's my calling. That's what I was made for. God made me to do this. This is what I'm good at. This is what I'm supposed to do. I grew up the first worship team, because my story is a little different because I did grow up in the church,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm a product of the church. And so I grew up on the stage in worship teams. I started at age 12. I was the first team that I was on. I was keyboard player and background vocals. And, I just grew up on the stage in church and just kind of grew up in it. My piano teacher was also the worship pastor and the co-pastor. I went to a church through my teenage years where it was co-pastored. Um, and both of the co-pastors were also gifted worship leaders. So it was a great situation. One of them was my piano teacher. And he had a master's in music from Southern Seminary. So he was, a theory guy. He was a composer. Um, so he was amazing. And he was on the job training. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm being taught classically, but at the same time, on Sunday mornings, I'm being put up in the worship team. Here, lead this song. Here, lead this team. So I'm learning how to be a worship leader all through. So by the time I graduated, and got my master's, got married, all those things, I was ready. This is what I'm going to do with my life, right? And it didn't work out that way. Just we ended up um, going to a large church for a few years. I helped out with the music ministry, but there was, I'm not leading worship. I'm just kind of in a supportive role.
Mm-hmm.
And then through a series of events, we ended up at the church we're at now. And through the journey to the church right now, we've been there 17 years. I had opportunities to lead worship in the churches we were in, along wherever we were. It was like the first thing I would do. We went to 3 or 4 different churches because when you're first married, you're kind of moving around, trying to figure out where you fit.
Yep.
We lived in a few different places, and every church we would join the first week, I would make sure that they knew that I was a musician. One church that our very first church we joined as a couple, they bought me a keyboard. We had been at the church for 2 weeks and it was a new church. So it was kind of a startup. They were building, they bought me a keyboard and here you go. You're our new keyboard worship leader. and just, that's the way it was. Wherever
Mm-hmm.
we were, it was understood. I'm doing music ministry. This is who I am. And so we get to the vineyard and that was the plan. Again, immediately I let them know, here we are. I'm a musician. I'm a singer. I'm a worship leader. I'm here for whatever you need. Here I am kind of thing. And in this particular church, they had like probably 10 worship leaders. It's a vineyard. Vineyards typically have a lot of people.
It's a lot. It's a worship centric movement.
It is. And at that time, we had multiple, so I wasn't really needed at all. And so of course it was, well, why don't you work with the children? So
So how did that sit with you as a musician, saying,
yes.
well, we really don't need that?
Right. So that was humbling, and I thought, okay, well, so we got into the church and we'd been there for 2 or 3 years and started to, I worked with the kids for a while. We got involved in children's ministry, which is a whole nother, working with elementary kids was something I told the Lord I never wanted to do. And I found myself, don't ever tell the Lord you don't want to do something. Just
Silly
don't.
you.
So I ended up, helping to head up the kids ministry. Well, during the course of time, after we'd been at the church for a little while, 2 or 3 years, it kind of got to the point where, okay, now maybe it's time for me to be on the worship team. And there was, the worship pastor at the time. We set up a meeting to, kind of, I guess it was sort of an interview, like set up a meeting to kind of discuss how and I was going to be involved on the team. And I'd waited a while to be at the church for long enough, where they were ready to involve me on the worship team. So I set up this meeting and I'm all excited, to get back into leading worship because this is what I'm supposed to do with my life, right? And a few days before this meeting, the Lord just completely change, like he changed everything in me. And what, I was just, sometimes when the Lord speaks to you, often it comes, like you were saying, with a woman had a word for you. It just comes when you're not even looking for it.
Oh, yes,
And,
yes.
you know,
Out
all
of
of
left
it,
field.
yeah. And the Lord started speaking to me one day, and he said, and it was just me, it was personal. It wasn't so much a word like for you, it was a word from someone else. For me, it was just a personal word. And I just knew it was the voice of the Lord. There are times when the Lord speaks to you and you just know it's his voice. Um,
Yeah.
because it has nothing to do with what was in your head before.
Oh,
All of a
his voice
sudden,
is unmistakable.
yeah, you just know his voice. And he says, the stage is a safe place for you. You know, you hide on the stage. And see, for me, I'm an introvert. I've always been. Um, I'm not the person that's the life of the party. I'm the wallflower. I'm the
Mhm.
person that's going to sit back and kind of observe everything and from afar. I'm in a one-on-one conversation, but in a group, I'm kind of awkward. I don't like being in large groups. I'm
Me
more of a
too.
one-on-one.
When I'm in
And
a room with a large group of people, I'm the guy in the corner was
yeah,
watching
that's
everything going
me.
on.
I'm gonna find one person that I can talk to and then stay there the whole night. I'm not gonna be. I'm just not an extrovert at all. So the Lord started to show me how I had, for my whole life, I had been hiding on stage. And for me, the stage was a very safe place because on the stage, I didn't have to talk to anybody. I didn't have to
Yes.
interact with anybody. And he began to show me how the churches we had been in before, because we had been in a few where I had been leading worship and on the stage, several, how I would, I'd show up on Sunday morning. I was very faithful. I would lead worship. I would play. And then after church, I would pack up and I would leave. And I would, it felt very comfortable. I didn't have to interact on
Right.
a deep level with people. And so the Lord said, you're not to be on the stage. It's time for you to be in the congregation. You need to sit.
Oh.
And then he says, you need to learn to love people. You don't love people because growing up in the church, another thing that's a byproduct of that for me was that I was very judgmental, and I saw a lot growing up. I grew up in a smaller church. We were very involved in leadership. I saw a lot of hypocrisy. I saw a lot of things. And so I could pick things out. I could, that person's this way and that person's this way. And, it was very easy for me to find fault.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so the Lord said, you're going to learn to love people. You're going to learn to pray for people, and you're going to learn to do hands-on ministry. We're not going to be on the stage hands-off ministry anymore. You're going to do hands-on ministry. That terrified me because the stage is safe for me.
I totally get
So
it because I'm like that too. I'm an introvert and I hide behind my guitar. I
yeah,
totally
I hide
recognize
behind
that.
my keyboards. I feel very safe as long as my keyboard's in front of me. It's a security,
And people think
blanket
I'm
for
being
me.
an extrovert because I love to be on stage and playing and
That's
singing.
the
No,
deception of it. Yeah,
if
it's
I'm
not.
because if I'm not playing or singing, I have to be out there talking to you.
Right. Well, that was how I grew up, and
Yeah.
I was in my late 20s at the time. So I had my first two daughters. I was a young mom, And so I was supposed to meet with the worship pastor and discuss this. So I went to the meeting with her. We met for coffee. And I said, well, we set up this meeting because I'm ready to join the worship team and start leading again. But the Lord told me that I can't. So she's really? And I said, yeah, he told me that I have to sit. Like I can't lead worship. So, and that was hard because I
Yes.
mean, that's who I am. It was like me but I had to lay it down. So it wasn't even a situation where someone took it away from me. It was more, I had to surrender it.
Yeah.
And so for the next several years, I sat in church. And it was the first time really that I had ever just sat in church. My whole life, I had been on the stage at church,
Mm-hmm.
you know, on that side. And I learned so much. I learned more about leading worship by sitting in the congregation for 3 or 4 years. I don't remember how many years, it was several years. I learned more by sitting than I had ever learned growing up in school, all the training I had as a worship leader. I learned more in those few years. And I got to where I had to push myself, but I got to where I loved praying for people. I'd go up to somebody and, can I pray for you? And it got fun, after I got over my fear.
Right.
And, but in that time, like God really taught me how to love his body. And I realized that I didn't love his body. I loved myself, you know, and I loved what I did. I loved music. I loved worship. I loved him. But I didn't really love his body. And,
It's fun. When we left
know,
Washington State, driving across the country, we'd gone through a big, ugly church split.
mm-hmm.
And I remember talking to God as I'm driving out Deception Pass towards Washington State, saying, Lord, Father, I love you, but I have a real problem with your kids.
Yeah.
That was, and now I'm curious, you said something that he taught you more about leading worship during that time of sitting out.
Yeah.
Elaborate on that a bit. Like what was it that God taught you?
There were several things. A lot of it was I learned what it felt like to be led in worship.
Mm-hmm.
To be on the receiving end of what the band and what the worship leader were doing on the stage. I learned what that felt like. I hadn't ever experienced it. I'd always been on stage. So I learned what it was like to just sit and for my voice to just be one of many. My voice not mic'd, just singing as part of the congregation and being it taught me what corporate worship really was. And it wasn't about my voice being heard. It was about my voice being in unity with all those around me. And it was such a different view.
Right.
And a different experience. And it wasn't about me anymore. It was about us. It was about the body together, corporately worshiping, our Lord and our King. And it was about him. I mean, really, it became vertical.
Wow.
So, but the funny thing was this went on for several years. And all this time, my husband and I were just doing children's ministry. So we got very involved in children's ministry. I did lead the kids in worship during that time. That was very different too. Leading children in worship is totally different. They don't care. They don't care who's leading. Like
and they are transparent and honest. Yeah. My wife and I led 3 and 4 year old worship for years.
Yes.
Yes, Mr. Garwood. Yes, sweetheart. You have a booger in your nose?
They tell you, right, whatever.
We're going to sing a song right now. Okay. You got a booger in your nose. Just wanted to tell you.
I learned a lot from that too, working with children. It was but the interesting thing was around the time that, I don't know, several years passed. And I remember I was sitting on my piano in my house because the other thing that I learned is that I needed to worship the Lord by myself in my house. And that was more important than worshiping him on the stage. And so I was sitting at my piano one day and I was just worshiping at my piano. I was just singing. And I just felt like the Lord said, it's time. It's time for you it's time. Like, I'm going to give this back to you now. It's time for you to lead again. So I go to my worship pastor and I told her that it was time. And another 2 or 3 years go by.
Yeah, that is so
there was
God.
No place. Like that they didn't need
God.
Yeah. It was almost like he was laughing because I was ready and he told me I was ready, but he's like, he didn't tell me, but you're going to have to wait another 3 years, So finally, and during those, after he told me it was time, it was harder because for the years that I knew it wasn't time, I could rest in that. But now I knew it was time. And every Sunday, I was just almost, during worship, I would just want to cry because I was sitting there and I wanted so bad to be up there. Not because I wanted to be, it was different now. It wasn't because I wanted to be on stage. It was just because I knew I was called to do it. And I knew God told me it was time, but nobody was letting me do it. And I was sitting there one Sunday and I was just at the bottom. I was so frustrated. And I was just like, Lord, when are you going to let me do this again? When are you going to give it back to me? I know you told me it was time. And another word that he spoke so clear that I will never forget it. Right in the middle of church, we're all singing and I'm sitting in the back row. And he says, if I never give this back to you, am I enough? And I
Oh
went,
my.
oh. I mean, that was, am I enough?
Oh,
And that wrecked me. I mean,
yes.
I mean, is he enough? And it was like, I may never give this back to you. Will
It's
you be okay with just me?
when I was going through that journey, that part of my journey, in the middle of it, I had a conversation with God, and I said, God, I'm not upset. I'm not angry. You can look at my heart. I'm not angry about not being involved in worship or anything,
Yeah.
but I'm just curious. You said you have ministry for me. And that's before he'd answered that question later on.
Yeah.
And he led me to the word, and he said, how old was Moses when I called him? I said,
Yes.
oh, about 40. But how old was he when I let him loose? He was
Like
80.
80.
Would you be
80.
willing to wait 40 years? If I said in
Yes.
40 years, I'm going to unleash you on the body of Christ and you will turn your world upside down. I said, yeah. I said, David was anointed king of Israel when he was a teenager,
Yeah.
but he had to wait 20 years or so before he became king. He said, would you be willing to wait 20 years?
We're still having conversations like that, the Lord and I.
Yeah.
Because there's things I'm still waiting on. And he's like, look at Moses, look at the,
I
it's all
know.
about
And he
waiting.
just started taking me down to character in the Bible. And he says, and this is when God taught me, I think, the most powerful thing that, and I hang on to this. He said, let's see if I've got one around here real quick. Oh, well, here's my calendar. Pretend it's a book. He says, you've written a book, Paige, right? It's okay. Let's say I've written a book. He said, you know everything. You know everything in this book. Page 1 through page 300. It's all now to you because you're the author of that book, right?
Right.
I said, yeah. But the characters in your book they only know one page at a time.
It's true.
They don't know what's going to happen in page 220. Yeah. You do. You wrote the book. He said, would you be happy with the fact if I told you I wrote your story?
Right.
And I am the author of your story. I know how it ends, and I'm telling you, you're fine. You just have to live it a page at a time.
Yeah.
And
he's so much more concerned with the fact that we love him and the character that he's building during those times than the destination. I always want to get to the destination. I always want to get to the, but he's more interested in what he needed to do in me. When he finally did allow me to get back to leading worship a while later, and it was just him, the way it happened. And that's a very long story, but I ended up being able through a process to lead worship again. And of course,
there's a freedom in it now.
Yeah, of course, now I lead every Sunday. I'm on every Sunday, and sometimes I look back and think, oh my goodness, if I could have known, but it's so different now. When I'm leading worship now, I think back to what it was like, 20 years ago. It's like the love that he's put in my heart for his body, it just overflows, and so when I'm leading worship, it's not about me anymore. It's just about him. And it's like we're all worshiping together. It just feels like, we're all doing this together. This is not a me up here performing or being up front, or I may be facilitating, I may be providing the background music, but we're singing together.
When a friend of mine who came out of Vineyard Church told me, he said, the worship leader is like a spiritual midwife. He's aiding and abetting the Holy Spirit in the birth of a worship experience. That's your place.
Yeah.
And you're not the
it's
stuff.
A supportive role, right?
You're not the star.
Yeah.
You're not the.
And it has to be infused with love, and that's what I was missing before. When it's infused with the love of Christ, it's like nothing. I mean, it's wonderful, but at the same time, it's like I hold it so loosely now. It's a privilege, and I'm blessed, and I love it. But you know what?
If God told you to lay it down, I bet you could now.
He's more important. you know.
Exactly. You know, it's funny. Uh, when God and I were just talking about this, you know, if I had the same conversations, it's like we must be related somewhere in our genealogy. You and I must be related. But I remember just being overwhelmed by the fact that um, I was hit with this thought once. Would I rather? And it was all about ego with me because I do love playing guitar,
Mm-hmm.
and bass. I ain't gonna lie. It was when I was in high school. That's how I dated girls. It's just
Mm-hmm. Well,
girls
yeah,
dig
when you're a
guitar
musician,
players.
it's who you are.
Yeah, so and we are musicians. We're troubadours, and musicians live for an audience.
Right.
And God took my audience away for almost 20 years.
Yep.
I had no audience, and I had to learn to live without that. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm to the point now where I really don't care if anybody hears me play or sing or anything anymore. But I heard God tell me once, would you rather die hearing the whole world shouting your name in praise and stand in front of me and hear these words? I never knew you.
Mm.
Or would you rather die and nobody knew you ever existed? And you stand in front of me and hear, well done, good and faithful servant.
Yep.
When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me water. When I was hungry, you gave me food. And you were going to say, but Lord, when did I ever do that to you? He said, when you did it to the least of these, you did it to mine. Enter
Above
now
all
into the
others.
joy of thy
Yeah.
Lord. And I would rather die. I would rather die being totally unknown to the world and known by God than to have that scenario twisted around and to hear, depart from me, you wicked, to the fire prepared for the devil and his angels, because I never knew you. And it's funny in the world of worship leading. Um, I'm a capable worship leader. I can do it, but God said no, and a no from God. It's God.
Mm-hmm.
I'd rather hear no
But
from Him than yes from anybody else.
but it feels like rejection, doesn't it? Sometimes when God says no,
In the
we
beginning, it did.
in the beginning we can
Yes.
battle with that. Why didn't you want me? You know,
It's
not
it's
enough.
funny. It's not that He didn't want me. He didn't want me there. He
Right.
wants me. I'm a husband of Glenda. I'm a father of Matt and
Yep.
Joy. I'm a grandfather of 3 grandchildren. And I am the patriarch of my clan. And that isn't a big deal to God. That is a huge deal to God.
Right.
My family started here in Georgia. In fact, came down across second voyage of the Mayflower, emigrated to this part of the country, Conyers area of Georgia, believe it or not.
Mm-hmm.
And then from Georgia went all points west, ending up in Alaska in the 1950s. And by, my moms would say, by chance, I'm right back to where we started. I'm back to where the Garwood family started. Only this time, I'm a Christian patriarch of a Christian Garwood clan, and God is helping me reestablish the Garwood name uh, as far as being champions of his kingdom, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And still nobody knows who we are. That's okay.
God does.
But
That's all that matters.
it's to me, there's so much joy in hearing your story because I really believe that if God said lay it down, I think you would. I think
Mm-hmm.
if God said, I want you to walk away, and He never has you walk away from something unless He has something for you that you're walking towards.
Well, it's funny because that's one thing that I've been dealing with in the past, year or so, that because in addition to being a worship leader, I'm also an accompanist and I work a lot in public schools. I do a lot of vocal coaching. And that's really, before I had my kids, I was a high school choir director for the public schools. And since I've been a mom, which has been 20 years now, hard to believe, I've been working for public schools as a contracted, accompanist, music teacher, vocal coach, things like that. And that's paid a lot of bills for us and kept me in the classroom, kept me doing the things that are associated with my profession so that I've always had this fear that I'm going to lose my skills,
Yeah.
And as a musician, you know what that's like. You just have this, I got to keep my skills, So I've been working in the public schools now for the past, 25 years. And this past last year, the Lord began to put on my heart that he wanted me to go back to school and get a seminary degree, which, that's a big thing. It's a lot.
I'm jealous
But
because you're getting a theology. Is it a theology degree?
I'm doing a master's in Christian education.
You're going to get some theology with that.
Which at Dallas Theological Seminary is a theology degree. It's a
Yes,
66 credit master's. It's so much theology. But
awesome.
the Lord began to talk to me about ministry. And he just said, you've been kind of had one foot in the music profession and one foot in ministry for a long time. And he began to show me that it was time for me to be all in ministry. That was a big thing because for years, I've held on to this part of me that's a career musician,
Mm-hmm.
And that was what he spoke to me when I really came down to this decision of, am I going to go to seminary? Because going to seminary means I'm going to have to quit doing a lot of things associated with my profession in order to have the time to study and write papers and all those things that come with school, as you know. And that's what the Lord spoke to me. He said, I can't give you what I have for you if you don't let go of some things. You have to let go so your hands will be empty.
Yes.
Hands are empty. I can give you these things you've been asking for and that I've been wanting to give you, but you've got to let go. And that was hard. It was very hard. Harder now that I'm older. There's more at stake. We have more bills. There's more. We have 4 children. So anyway, he calls us to let go of things often so that.
There's a story. Did you ever see that movie Chariots of Fire by any chance?
Yeah.
All right. The lead character in that, of course, was this a missionary. He and his sister were raising money. I think they're going to China to be missionaries, where he actually ended up dying there in the mission field. But while he was raising money, of course, he was on the Great Britain's track and field team. He was a world-class middle distance runner. And God used that movie to show me something incredible with me as far as music goes, because I'll get back moving in a second. In my life, I knew that, I thought God put music into my life so I could be a player, so I could be a worship pastor or worship leader, or so I could play in church even. You gave me music because you want me to minister to the body of Christ.
Right.
I was so out of touch. In that movie, his sister is very frustrated with him, and she asked him, why do you run so much? Why do you feel the obsession with running? And his response was a goosebump moment for me. It was like he said, because God made me to run fast. And when I run, I feel his pleasure. That was it.
Yes.
And there was not going to be any monetary reward for his running. He ran fast for the sole reason that when he runs, when he's doing what God made him to do, being what God made him to be, he feels God's pleasure. And it's just like a thunderbolt hit me. That's why music's in my life. It isn't so that I will serve the body of Christ. It isn't so that it's just.
It's vertical.
He gave it to me because he loves me. That's it.
Yeah.
And when I play, I feel God's pleasure.
Yeah.
And it's the same pleasure I feel when I see my son play or my daughter play. My daughter plays flute because she loves to. She's not a professional flautist, though she got a dual degree in college, music performance in bassoon and flute, and then math. And she's making her money as a mathematician. But she plays flute because she loves to. And that was a lesson that took me probably 30 years to learn, that the reason I have music in my life is because God loves me. And that's it. If nobody ever hears a song I write, that's okay. God did. And that's why you see in my church posts almost every Sunday that I'm playing church, I'm playing for an audience of one, because that's honestly how I feel. He's the only one. And this title of this podcast, For the Only One That Matters.
Right. By
the way, it was going to be called For an Audience of One, till I found out that 400 other people have podcasts called For an Audience of One. I'm not nearly as original as I thought. But God put music in your life. He put music in my life. He put teaching skill because he loves you. And he takes pleasure when you excel and when you play and teach, when you do these things that line up with the skill sets he gave you, he gets pleasure in that. And in the end, isn't that all that matters.
In the end, it's just that we're loved by God.
Yep.
Everything about what we do is just because he loves us. You're right.
And
I
my son poked my balloon and let all the air out one day, and I was complaining a little bit because I'd gotten this close to a record deal. This is like 10 or 15
mm,
years ago. I got
mm-hmm.
this close to a record deal, and of course it fell through. That's what they do. And I was complaining a little bit about it. He said, Dad, and I don't know if you've already experienced this, but your kids are going to come at you with truth bombs that are
Oh,
straight
yes.
from the throne of God. And
Yes.
you're going to be like struck dumb. He said, Dad, do you know that 10 years after you're dead, nobody will ever know you lived? Why are you chasing after something that will be gone so quickly from people's consciousness? He
Mm-hmm.
said, live today for what makes God happy. Forget the record deal. It doesn't mean anything.
Yep.
And and again, it was one of those moments where I was totally set free by that, because all of a sudden I realized this world is transitory. It's going away. It's not
Temporal.
our
Yeah.
world. We don't
No.
belong here. We are enemies of the state as
Sure.
Christians. And this is not where we're going to end up. So why do we
Yep.
chase it so?
I had when I was a teenager, I had a teacher say one time, and it's always stuck with me. It's just kind of been one of my mottos in life. But she said, we have to remember the shortness of time and the length of eternity. And when you live that way, it changes everything, because it's not about here. This is
Yes.
so short.
Oh,
It's just a blink.
there's a pastor I saw. He was preaching, and during his whole sermon, he was holding on to a rope. Didn't say anything about the rope. He was just holding on to a rope. And on the rope, the end of it, but the end of it, like that much, was painted red.
Oh, yeah.
Do you remember? Have you seen
Yes.
this?
I've seen this one. Yeah.
It was awesome. He said, "This red represents our life here on earth. The rest of this rope is eternity." Why are we getting so bent out of shape out of an inch and a half of rope?
All in perspective, right?
It is. Oh my goodness. But you know what? The thing I like about these interviews is that I never know where they're going to go. And it has been such an incredible blessing to hear your story and to see where God's taking you. And I wanted to get into some music related stuff, technical music, because I'm a nerd and that's what I like. And I know that there's some music nerdiness that dances around inside your skull.
Oh, yes.
And I would love to catch up with you and talk more about that.
Sounds good.
But we're at the end of our time. And there's like another hour we could go on for this stuff. Oh my goodness. But I want to thank you, first of all, for being my friend. We've been working together in each other's periphery
Many
for
years. Yeah.
a lot of years. And
Many
you're one
years.
of those people where that I've always said, God, I want to get to know this lady. And of course, now I've taught two of your daughters, and your oldest daughter is in college. By the way, a charismatic Pentecostal girl in a Reformed college. That's a bold
yeah, that's
move.
been really interesting for her. She's learning a lot.
You know, I had a preacher tell me once, he said, go to a Baptist seminary to learn how to serve.
Yeah.
Go to a Reformed seminary to learn theology.
Yes. It's been really good. And it's fun because me being in seminary and her being in Reformed, and the seminary that I'm in is, kind of different theology than what she's learning. So we're having a lot of great conversations. It's been a really fun time for her.
Well, she was actually one of my favorites when I was teaching at Master's Academy. First of all, the girl can sing. Just
she
saying.
Can. She's minoring in voice now. So.
But the thing that blessed me the most was that when she was in my class, she felt very free to speak to me about her speech impediment that she had going on at the time. She stutters sometimes.
Which she's
and
outgrown.
I've seen some kids that were just devastated by that. And she just ran that flag up the flagpole and marched on down the road. She just seemed to, she had a maturity about her that even then was amazing to me. And
I have great kids. I'm so blessed.
And then your other daughter, I'm teaching bass too? if she decides that's what she wants to be for the rest of life, she will be a world-class bassist. I have no
she's
doubt.
a treasure.
She's awesome. So I knew by them that you'd be a great lady to get to know, because children are reflections of their parents. And so
they're my number
you,
one ministry. That's the other thing, is everything else, has to come secondary to that.
Yep.
That's the calling.
Yep.
Disciple your kids.
Thank you so much for this time. We're going to
have to do this again. Thank you for having me.
Now, I have another podcast. It's called The Emerging Composer, and I think that would be a good place to interview you, where we talk. We have to put the preaching aside.
Talk some music.
And talk some music.
We'll dig into the profession side.
Oh, that would be awesome. That would be awesome. Great. Well, God's blessings to you, dear lady. And I will see you a little further up the creek.
Well, thanks. God bless you.
See you later. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
I love Kelly's story. I am just so encouraged after talking with her. We will talk with her again. Thank you for joining us for another episode of For the Only One That Matters. I'm Mr. G, and I'm out of here.